twene na so a kire se sempemu se hiu treasure life enuma no edijuma eye pure organic omachiri kwa nyanyira kwankra circle rank clinic na opposite ho na wo treasure life a ubenya se die onyankopa domara kwa ebi kurampa kopie kufodua na yedika de enkra number no amount 0244 361 263 0244 361 263 a treasure life pure organic o fresh number ya omo nuanu no na hodo se enum eniema omo echi nsuo anya mprese dabi wenya prese sambia ana wanom na obuafo no etise nsuo no na onom a esiesie ni padua no wani wadwene mu wo brabo wo yam wo jonku usisi nkotodwe wo mposo wo ntirimu say ye osa say ye diabetes say ye BP say ye cholesterol esiesie ni padua eyi asthma yare nyina efiri ni padua mu try your life na pure organic. Hallelujah. Amen. Hallelujah. Great actually. Kofodia for sending number way 0243 35 8599. Kofodia DNN 0243 35 8599. Yankopon Shraw. And then so aye nuaba Florence Abuadua na woda our kwasoro Victory Presby Church and then when you fear the nine ante mercy and no different central hill by amen. Ya kai unse say akaka kra bi nyame bo say wochena na yesi bosumi etosu num enti 15 for pepper na enyanka no ye kwa akosra wo yesra wo fa wodi ewura mu bi
Usafo nipa bebre na ya de.
Oh, Auntie Helena.
Oh yeah.
Auntie Helena nyame kupon shira wo. De amina ye de aba no play.
Okay. Auntie Vera so frame say o aseni ni kakra no so won waseni. Usafo oh yeah sofo. Mama bi frame so o 10 cedi.
Aye.
Na me si fabra. O de atusu.
Anti Grace is a corporate animal.
Only Marcus. And then met to one more. And it to one more. Obi also be I dum so for be per se or Buakakra. So was her number no. Battle you. If you know number, more feeling no man. It's a name to one more. No agent. There be so for. So for Yamia dum so a Sunday way, me call Casua La Paz, down Suma, and I. Na, was here there be? Battle you. Opa, sorry. What if Ome wola pass ome wo kaswa oh my god dansumania wa mum nyina ya we bacho Yusuf enti wa wo sa area mo no wa mfu ye bibi maye no ye de ko chenya nka no so imam bisu frame so wo bodwase kwan no so awo kaswa bacho you oprekuma na hefa o beta oprekuma me okay de beta oprekuma enti nyame ya aduma we ye beye oze ye.
And we were really not supposed to talk to journalists or people outside Apple.
À des journalistes ou à des personnes en dehors d'Apple. En prenant ces captures d'écran, j'ai la preuve.
By taking these screenshots, I had proof that there were millions and millions of recordings out there.
Chacun des projets qui étaient concernés.
For example, for the iPads, when I took the screenshots, there were 14 different countries involved. Each of these work projects contains 600,000 to 1.2 million recordings for a total of 1,000 hours per country.
Pour un total de 1000 heures par pays. On peut dire
on average, there are 8 to 12 million recordings for each of these projects, which make up one tab on a very long scrolling menu.
Sur un menu défilant qui est très long. Je me sens dépassé par l'ampleur de la chose, je me sens dépassé par...
I feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of it.
Par la taille
by the size of these companies,
de ces entreprises-là,
and also by the economic and political stakes behind them.
Les enjeux économiques et politiques qui viennent derrière.
But it's not that complicated to refuse to take part in it.
Et moi, j'aimerais témoigner à visage découvert.
I'd like to show my face as I hope others will follow suit.
Et que c'est déjà une première étape.
It's already a first step to defend oneself.
Pour se défendre. Et puis,
and then to counterattack.
Parce que
despite what we're led to believe, it's not normal. It's not normal, and it's not a given. It shouldn't be.
Ça ne devrait pas l'être.
Alors, aujourd'hui, il y a un début de résistance qui se met en place, il y a des formes d'organisation émergentes.
Today, the resistance is starting to take place.
Des organisations qui
Click workers are organizing.
C'est des syndicats, c'est des organisations syndicales qui investissent.
Trade unions are reaching out to these new populations of workers to defend their rights, to organize them.
Défendre leurs droits, pour les organiser.
C'est abusé, mais c'est pour ça
It's too much. So we voted to get paid by the hour, plus the orders. If you don't get an order, you still get paid. It's work.
Ouais.
Là, on est d'astreinte, on est comme des pompiers.
We're on call like firefighters, but they get paid. But we're not paid when we're on call.
On est là, on est
We're connected and ready to deliver, but we're not paid. So I think it's only logical to be paid once you're connected to the app.
payé à partir du moment où tu te connectes.
Ludovic, je suis coursier pour Deliveroo depuis quelque chose
I'm
comme 7
Ludovic.
mois maintenant. Il y a des moments où j'ai
I've been a Deliveroo driver for 7 months.
Et à côté de
I
ça,
work
je suis syndiqué
part-time.
à la CGT.
I'm also a union rep in the CGT's Job and Security Committee.
Et ça fait quelques semaines que
For the past few weeks, we've been trying to get organized against the companies we work for.
justement à s'organiser contre les plateformes pour lesquelles on travaille. Et sur Lyon, en tout cas pour le moment, on
We're
essaie
trying to raise awareness and show Uber and Deliveroo that they can't do whatever they want.
pas faire ce qu'ils veulent et que ça
They've
fait
tried to set up this status quo in recent years,
à généraliser,
and it's become widespread.
mais que de l'autre côté,
But the workers want to have a say in things.
décider aussi, parce que ce sont eux qui produisent.
Ça reste privé, tu vois, c'est qu'à nous, le syndicat pour la CGT. En fait, ce qu'on demande, c'est une connexion et une rémunération, et qu'il y a de meilleures conditions de travail, une meilleure assurance.
Les plateformes invitent leurs travailleurs,
The platforms invite their workers to be self-employed.
ce qui est une vision extrêmement individualiste.
This is an extremely individualistic and capitalistic vision.
Il y a de plus en plus de travailleuses et de travailleurs qui disent
Paradoxically enough, more and more workers are saying, I'll be responsible for myself.
prend en main.
I'll take charge of my own destiny, but I'll do it collectively.
Là, on voit par exemple apparaître des
We see, for example, workers for Uber creating a cooperative.
par exemple qui créent leur alternative coopérative.
There were demonstrations against Deliveroo. I worked for them with other colleagues. Over the course of time, we started to realize that the working conditions they proposed were catastrophic. We asked them to improve certain things. Altogether, we decided to start a project. We set up a cooperative. We sought to refute the idea that you must go with the flow and that Uber is a model for the future. We want to prove that technology can also be ethical, that it's not incompatible with the way a cooperative works. It can be democratic.
D'una forma més democràtica, no?
Nosaltres no, treballem amb contracte, amb baixa, amb vacances
At Mansakas, we have contracts, sick pay, paid vacations, pay slips. Our organization is horizontal, not vertical, or a pyramid. There's no hierarchy. All the workers, without exception, have exactly the same rights and the same salary. Our company is a non-profit cooperative. All the money we make is reinvested in the cooperative.
At the moment, there are about 30 of us. I'm very confident as far as the future of Mensakas is concerned. We have to keep moving forward. For us, on the one hand, but also to prove on a more general level that there is an alternative.
Our model is starting to be exported. Similar projects are emerging in other cities. In Madrid, our colleagues founded La Pájara Ciclamesa Jarea, which works as a cooperative. It's also the case elsewhere in Europe. People are starting cooperatives that were born out of a similar struggle. There are some in Belgium, in France. I think that little by little, it's a model that will grow. What we need to generate is a large-scale social awareness of what's going on. It's true that technology makes our lives easier. These new ways of consuming won't disappear. But we have to be aware of the consequences that they can have. Every time we consume a product, we have to ask ourselves where it comes from. It's time for the working class to step forward and propose alternatives. If we don't get organized to defend our rights, no one will do it for us. We have to make our voices heard so things can change.
It's not easy to spot.
I'm saying one thing, industry is saying another.
The great bluffs of the 20th century. Present-day hoaxes. And who's behind them?
Fake news.
Manufacturing Ignorance starts May 3rd on DW.
This is DW News, live from Berlin. Dozens are dead, many more critically injured in a stampede at a Jewish religious gathering in Israel. The cause of the disaster is unclear. It is the first big religious gathering to be held legally since Israel lifted coronavirus restrictions. Also coming up, begging for oxygen to save a relative's life. In India, people desperately search for medical supplies as the country battles a record-breaking spike in COVID-19 infections and deaths. Plus, stocking up on provisions as Turkey enters its strictest lockdown of the pandemic, with the country fighting its own wave of COVID-19 infections. I'm Sarah Kelly. Welcome to the program. At least 44 people have been killed and around 150 others injured in a stampede at a religious gathering attended by tens of thousands. It happened at Mount Meron in the northern part of the country, where ultra-Orthodox Jews were holding an all-night prayer and a dance celebration.
This footage from social media shows the scene shortly before tragedy struck. A densely packed crowd dancing ecstatically at the annual Lag BaOmer celebration. Authorities believe overcrowding is likely to blame for the fatalities and injuries. Rescue workers say many of the dead were either trampled to death or suffocated.
We just finished treating one of Israel's worst disasters. A terrible disaster of people who came to celebrate Lag BaOmer at Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and unfortunately were literally crushed to death.
It was the first large-scale religious gathering to be held legally since Israel lifted most coronavirus restrictions. But despite Israel's successful handling of the pandemic, health authorities had warned against holding a gathering of this size. The Lag BaOmer religious festival is particularly popular with Israel's ultra-Orthodox community. Israeli police report nearly 100,000 people attended the gathering, which they say is 4 to 5 times as many as should have been in a location like this.
And from Jerusalem, I'm joined now by journalist Sami Sokol. Sami, tell us, what more happened here?
Yeah, well, this is an annual event, and in previous years we've had up to 200,000 people on the Mount Meron for these festivities. But it seems that this year was a bit different. There were different arrangements on the site, and this what is causing this stampede that brought about to the death of 38 religious men, all of them belonging to a group which is known here as the Toldot Aaron. This is a group based here in Jerusalem, an ultra-Orthodox group, and they were kind of told by police to leave the site so as to enable other groups to come in. We have to remember that last night was a Thursday night, today is a Friday, and everything was done in a very hasty way because of the upcoming Sabbath.
And as you've highlighted there, I mean, the Lag BaOmer, it's considered to be one of the most important in the Orthodox community. Could this have been prevented? What went wrong?
Yeah, well, Lag BaOmer it comes at no surprise. This is a major event, and there's been thousands of police there. And what we see is mismanagement. I would say most of it is a kind of a mismanagement on a local level. There were gates that were supposed to be open. According to eyewitnesses who've been speaking to the media, they've been saying that certain gates were not open when they were supposed to be open, emergency gates, that the police force at the time did not realize the scope of this, of the tragedy, of the upcoming tragedy. But we also have to remember that there's great distrust between this specific religious group, the Toldot Aaron. They regard themselves as anti-Zionists, and they often are in friction with police. So we already from the beginning, we don't have a good relationship between this group and the police. And maybe this is also one of the reasons that we saw what we saw.
Tell us a little bit more about, in the context of what you're saying right there, and also in the context of what's happening on the ground, then with the challenges that the authorities might be facing, because we understand that there are still people on the mountain. The rescue forces, how do they handle this now?
Yeah, well, the rescue forces, once the reports came in, they had the helicopters, the Air Force had helicopters coming to the location, evacuating the wounded to hospitals. The ambulances came, and everyone on this mountain were taken out. Special trains were operated from nearby towns so as to evacuate everyone. Once this tragedy was known, There were you can hear the footage. Actually, was in Hebrew and in Yiddish. This is a community that speaks Yiddish, and they were told to leave the site. And everyone has been by now has been evacuated. But of course, there will be an investigation, and we're seeing this as a major tragedy that Israel has not seen for decades, I would say.
Sammy Sokol joining us with the very latest. Thank you. Let's take a look at some other stories making headlines. In Hong Kong, 4 democracy activists have pled guilty to charges of illegal assembly for the rally in June of last year. Jailed activist Joshua Wong was among them. Tens of thousands of people gathered on June the 4th to commemorate the 1989 crackdown on protesters in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. At least 13 people have been killed in fighting on the frontier between the Central Asian nations of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Dozens more were injured. Poorly drawn borders dating back to the Soviet Union have caused tension between the two neighbors. Turning to India now, which is seeing another spike in COVID-19 cases with over 380,000 new infections reported in the last day. Despite international aid arriving, oxygen is still in short supply across the country. Overwhelmed hospitals have been forced to turn patients away, leaving their relatives desperately trying to source medical supplies themselves.
A woman begs. She pleads as she tries to find oxygen for her desperately sick mother. My mother is very seriously ill, and for the past 2 days we've been trying to get a bed in so many hospitals in Delhi. Across India, oxygen is still in desperately short supply. In the capital, Delhi, volunteers from the Sikh community have set up an oxygen centre in a car park. People are suffering, begging for oxygen. We arranged for cylinders from anywhere we could. We stood in queues for whole nights and sometimes got beaten up by the police. Russia is the latest country to join an international relief effort.
Actually, there has been quite an outpouring of, I would say, solidarity with India. There's been an outpouring of let's say, assistance from various countries. Over 40 countries have actually committed to provide us with many of the items that we need most urgently.
India is the world's biggest producer of vaccines. But these too are lacking as people scramble to get their shot.
There are so many people are suffering here. I have no mercy for them. Where the humanity is gone.
Despite all this, millions have been voting in the state of West Bengal. The infection rate there is the highest since the pandemic began. Political parties have been criticized for holding crowded election rallies, just when India is recording the deadliest days so far for any country during the pandemic.
Well, meanwhile, in Turkey, the country has entered full lockdown, its strictest since the start of the pandemic, as it fights its own battle with soaring COVID-19 cases and deaths. People have been ordered to stay at home for nearly 3 weeks, only allowed to go outside for grocery shopping and other essential needs. Correspondent Yulia Han sent us this report from Istanbul.
Saying goodbye, a moment of calm, but only briefly. There is not much time for farewells here in Zincirlikuyu, at one of the largest cemeteries in Istanbul. While the families mourn outside, the next coffins are already arriving. The funeral home workers try to ensure that everything is as dignified as possible, but it has been Turkey's deadliest month since the pandemic began, and that has also become very apparent here.
Before the pandemic, we had around 200 funerals per day. There are now more than twice as many. We urgently need the new lockdown. But we should have made this decision earlier. Then probably fewer people would have died.
Shortly before the new lockdown came into effect, the streets and shops were full again. Above all, alcohol was in great demand because from now on there is a ban on sales. Residents are only allowed to leave their homes for essential needs until mid-May. It is not the first coronavirus curfew in Turkey, but the strictest one so far. Most of public life is supposed to come to a standstill for 2.5 weeks. But many people are wondering how they will get through this time, as they can't hope for any financial aid. Especially in the poorer neighborhoods of Istanbul, many are worried. Only a few have permanent jobs here in Tarlabaşı. Most of them make a living as day laborers or trash collectors.
Only God knows how we'll manage. But there is nothing we can do. We will try to survive somehow.
I don't have a husband. My daughter has just had a baby. We are 6 people living in a small room and we already don't have enough money to live on. Critics of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan say he hesitated too long, which made the situation worse. Although Turkey has the highest number of daily new infections in Europe, Erdogan held several party congresses with thousands of members of his ruling AKP in March. A few days ago, he pulled the emergency brake.
We must rapidly reduce the number of new infections to fewer than 5,000 a day. Otherwise, we will inevitably pay a heavy price in every field, from tourism to trade and education.
A small sacrifice, says the president, for a greater goal. In about 2 weeks, at the end of Ramadan, Turkey will emerge from its lockdown, hoping that its latest crisis is under control.
Well, Germany will start returning sculptures looted from Africa during colonial times. The objects, known as the Benin bronzes, were originally taken by British soldiers in the 19th century. They were later sold to museums worldwide, and many were held in Germany. They are considered some of Africa's greatest cultural treasures and will be returned to Nigeria next year. You're watching DW News. Quick reminder of our top story. At least 44 people have been killed in a stampede at a religious festival attended by tens of thousands. It happened at Mount Meron in the northern part of the country, where ultra-Orthodox Jews were holding a prayer and a dance celebration. Up next, it is business news with my colleague Stephen Beardsley. Do stay with us if you can for that. There's always more on the website, dw.com. I'm Sarah Kelly. Thanks for watching.
India's coronavirus crisis, a DW News special. We'll look at the dramatic situation in Delhi and the impact of the triple mutation on the country. How can the rest of the world help? What can be done for the people? And how can India bring the situation under control? A special edition of DW News on the coronavirus crisis in India starts today at 11 UTC on DW.
Well, Europe shows signs of economic recovery in the first quarter. The French economy returns to growth. Germany will release its figures soon. New cases and continued lockdowns pose a challenge for the continent. China kicks off a consumer products expo in Hainan, part of its effort to encourage more personal spending. But are Chinese prepared to open their purses? And in Colombia, tens of thousands protest government plans to tax smaller incomes, a plan the government says is necessary to offset economic damage from the pandemic. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Stephen Beardsley in Berlin. It's good to have you with us. Well, the French economy has returned to growth, posting 0.4% in growth in the first quarter. Figures are still being awaited for Germany for later today. They're expected to show GDP falling during the first quarter as the country is hit with a devastating third wave of the pandemic. Now, Germany is currently in a drastic lockdown as the country's vaccination effort is underway after a slow start. Consumption as well as the service sector have been hit hardest, while the manufacturing sector remains relatively strong and is expected to help the German economy to a strong pickup in the second half of the year. All right, let's go to our financial correspondent, Conrad Busen in Frankfurt. Conrad, good morning. What are we expecting from these figures later today?
Good morning, Stephen. The numbers are expected to be on the downside. 1.5% decline for the first quarter is being expected. People now at the exchange are really talking about what's going on at the moment in the current quarter, and they are all predicting that the recovery is about to start. The more we have people vaccinated, the more those contact-sensitive sectors of the German economy, restaurants, theaters, etc., can reopen.
Conrad, there's been some debate recently over to what extent these GDP figures, these growth figures, really reflect the state of the current German economy, for example. What can you tell us about the difference between, say, industrial output and the service sector?
Yeah, it's really a split picture at the moment. We have on the one side really a strong recovery of the manufacturers in Germany. Many German, machines are in demand, auto cars are in demand. The fine technology made in Germany that we sell so well worldwide is really in great demand as Asia has restarted its economy so quickly. On the other hand, we have, as I said, the restaurants, the theater people, everything that's contact, that's not really working yet. And that's why the exact number we'll be getting, is it going to be minus 1.5%? Is it going to be minus 1.3%? It's not really important. What's really important is the psychology behind it. And, well, I have to say, many people are really fed up with the corona pandemic here in Germany. They want to get out. They want to get out in the sun, get some fresh air. And hopefully that will also mean that they will start, go shopping.
You mean their optimism isn't buoyed by an uptick in manufacturing? Okay, Conrad Busen there in Frankfurt. Thank you very much. All right, let's shift gears and take a look at Asia. China has long been the workbench of the world, cheaply producing goods to be sold overseas. Now, Beijing would like to change that in part, and that's part of the Chinese government's current 5-year plan to make the country one of the world's largest consumer markets. Now, this weekend, Beijing wants to turn the Labor Day holidays into a consumer extravaganza of sorts. Major online stores and millions of brick-and-mortar retailers across the country are participating, offering new products, promising high quality. Now, major international brands are playing along, with U.S.-based Tesla and Dell, Switzerland's Swatch, Japan's Shiseido offering their latest at major consumer events. The goal is to turn workers into shoppers. For years, Chinese consumption had grown at a steady rate of about 8 to 9% annually. That was before it crashed due to the coronavirus pandemic, and then, of course, regaining some of that ground lately. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by DW correspondent in Taipei, Zhou Zhanghan. Zhou, it's good to see you. China is about to host this first ever International Consumer Products Expo. That's what it's called in Hainan. Why is it so important to Beijing to increase this consumer sentiment in China?
Well, as you mentioned, China kicks off a series of high-profile promotional activities, including the Consumers Expo that we talked about here. The main reason is because the consumption recovery remained unbalanced, with some of the areas, business models, categories, and regions in a comparatively slow mode, and the demand of average shopper has not been fully satisfied. So even though the rebound in retail spending so far is conspicuous, but the growth rate is still much lower than the pre-COVID-19 period. So it's an indication that there is still a significant room to improve.
So I would say that probably pre-pandemic, there were probably more people with money in their purses, perhaps, right? Businesses were still open. Are consumers right now ready to spend post-pandemic?
Well, if we look at the numbers, yes. China's retail sales surged 34.2% year-on-year in March, better than expected by many analysts, and stronger than the jump in January to February. And the retail revenue were 12.9% higher than March 2019. That's before the pandemic broke out. However, if we look at the household savings rate, it remains stubbornly high in the first quarter. So that means people still want to put their money in their pocket. And if we look at the vaccination situation, it still has a long way to go before the herd immunity can be achieved. So the consumption recovery will be gradual in a sequential basis.
All right, so the question for Beijing, how to draw that savings out and get them to spend it. So this first expo is happening in Hainan. That's a location of special significance for Beijing lately, isn't it?
Yes, Chinese President Xi Jinping, he personally said that he wants to make Hainan the free trade port and the biggest special economic free trade area in China. So we can see that his plan to build this place as a trading platform for international consumer goods. And it's also a sign and also the national strategy to show that Beijing wants to open up and to do the reform. So Expo will be a window to see this master plan.
All right, so Zhang Han in Taipei, always a pleasure. And we go now to some of the other business stories making headlines. The U.S. economic recovery picked up speed in the first quarter, growing at an annual rate of 6.4%. The rebound largely driven by consumers who had stimulus checks to spend. The U.S.'s vaccination rollout also allowed many businesses to reopen their doors again. Amazon's pandemic boom isn't showing signs of slowing down. The company saying its first quarter profit more than tripled from a year ago to $8.1 billion, fueled by the surge in online shopping. Revenue came in at over $100 billion, the second quarter in a row that the company has passed that milestone. Pfizer has begun exporting its COVID-19 vaccine from the U.S. The first batches were sent to Mexico. It's possible now that a Trump administration rule barring exports has expired. Many countries where the virus is still rampant are struggling to acquire supplies. Germany and France will receive 300 million euros from the European Union to cope with the effects of the pandemic. Germany says it will go to improving distance learning for students. The money comes from the REACT EU program, which has a size of 55 billion euros. All right, over to the Caucasus. Armenia is once again ready to welcome tourists, but a combination of factors is working against it, from the pandemic to last year's war in Nagorno-Karabakh and the country's subsequent political crisis. Particularly affected are Armenian restaurants, where the traditional conviviality is becoming harder to find.
Berry smoothies, margaritas and cheesecake. Demand is falling for such treats in Yerevan. People here have been saving their money and avoiding cafes and bars due to the pandemic and the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. This restaurant in central Yerevan is normally popular with artists, students and businessmen. But owner Nata Antonian is grateful that the restaurant survived the past year.
Our usual customers are definitely not ready to have fun yet. The behavior that we can observe here has changed a lot. Our customers used to order alcohol, celebrate and have family gatherings and small parties. Right now, we can see that they're talking about current events. People are anxious, and I think that we're going through a major existential crisis.
Tourism is another sector that has suffered. Last year, the Armenian tourism sector's revenue dropped by almost 90%. Analyst Boris Nevosardyan says that the new political crisis is also having a negative impact on Armenia's economy. Many people see the problems as linked to Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. People are already starting to think that the current government is so ineffective that it might be better if somebody new would come and get things back under control and start solving our problems. In 2020, Armenia's GDP dropped almost 8%. The food service sector was also hit hard. Some restaurants have either temporarily closed or have gone bankrupt altogether. According to Nata Antonian, restaurateurs have no room for error. She hopes that with spring just around the corner, the mood of Yerevan residents will brighten up.
All right, let's finish with a look at Latin America. Colombia is currently battling its deadliest phase of the coronavirus outbreak. The country recorded 17,000 new cases on Thursday, and earlier this week, a whopping 500 deaths in a 24-hour period. Now, to offset the huge economic hit the country has taken during the pandemic, the government wants to start taxing smaller incomes. The plan has sparked massive protests.
For days, Colombians have been protesting plans to boost tax revenues that they say would hit the poorest hardest. The coronavirus pandemic has left the South American country in its worst recession in half a century. The government says it needs to take drastic steps to avoid a runaway budget deficit. It says the proposed tax reforms are crucial for Colombia to keep its investment-grade debt rating, but they would lower the threshold at which people become liable for income tax. The protesters say that could spell poverty for millions, just as the country enters a new lockdown.
This march is the biggest display of outrage against this government, against the tax reform, and against the labour and pension reform. The government has gone against the country, and the country is responding in more than 500 communities.
Income inequality in Colombia is among the highest in Latin America. About half the working population depends on informal work. The World Bank warned that 4 million people, more than 1 in 10, was threatened with poverty in the next few years, undoing the successes of the last decade. And that was before the proposed tax reform. Anger has long been growing against the government of President Ivan Duque, but now, as Duque's administration fails to get the pandemic under control, that anger has boiled over.
And that's it for me and the DW Business team here in Berlin. For more on these and other business stories, visit us online at dw.com/business. Also find us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll be back in a few hours with more business news. Until then, take care.
Scotland is at a crossroads. Remain part of Britain or leave. Rejoin the EU or not. The question is dividing the country and entire families. In the run-up to the elections, the debate is heating up. Scotland's quest for independence.
Focus on Europe. Next on DW. These places in Europe are smashing all the records. Step into a bold adventure. It's the treasure map for modern globetrotters. Discover some of Europe's record-breaking sites. On Euromax, YouTube, and now also in book form.
Hello and welcome to Focus on Europe. I'm Lara Babalola. It's nice to be back. Many of us are itching to travel again, but the pandemic still poses huge challenges. Some travel agencies have found a niche market and are luring tourists to Moscow for vaccine getaways. The all-inclusive deals offer luxury with a dose of Russia's own Sputnik V shot. Sightseeing at the Red Square isn't the only main attraction for their customers. Well, they include this couple from Germany, Heinz-Gerd Pinkernell and his wife, Katja Harms. She was born in Russia and longs to travel again and see her family. But Germany's vaccine program prioritizes the elderly and at-risk groups, which means they'll have to wait their turn. For-profit companies are now solving this problem with vaccine tourism. But should money allow people to jump the queue? For some, it's a no-brainer.
Liftoff on the journey to immunity. At Frankfurt Airport, Heinz-Gert Pinkanel and his wife Katja are setting off for an unusual type of vacation. After months of searching for ways to get vaccinated abroad, they're off to Moscow. A round-trip package, complete with a Sputnik V shot.
We can't assume that we'll get vaccinated anytime soon in Germany, to be honest. But the more people that are vaccinated, the faster we'll achieve herd immunity. So if there's the option of getting vaccinated in Moscow, then that just makes sense.
The Norwegian travel operator is waiting for the guests from Germany on arrival. Most of them have booked the COVID package. It includes a tourist visa, a stay in Moscow, and the vaccination, all for just under 2,000 euros. 50 Germans are taking part in the first of these trips, and there's a lot of media hype, including from Russian state TV.
I feel like we're being stalked. I'm a lawyer, and sometimes when a deal we work on attracts a lot of media buzz, this can happen. But it's not quite at this level. I'm not political about this. I'm not a Kremlin critic or a Kremlin supporter. I'm fairly neutral. As long as I get my vaccine, then that's a great result.
But Russian authorities seem to have their own goals in mind. The so-called All-Russia People's Front, a political organization headed by President Vladimir Putin himself, has been providing visa support for the tour operator World Visitor.
Of course, this is PR for Russia, but what's the problem?
Sputnik V has become Russia's calling card around the world. Even its name is a clear nod to Soviet victories during the space race. The vaccine has been approved in over 60 countries worldwide. That despite questions about early trial data for the jab. Since the vaccine rollout kicked off in December, Vladimir Putin has been personally promoting Sputnik V and presenting Russia as a scientific superpower.
We've said from the start, and now it's been shown in practice as well, the Russian vaccine is the best in the world.
But people in Russia are still skeptical. Here, the vaccination campaign has been slow. COVID restrictions have been lifted almost entirely, leaving little incentive for people to get the jab. One survey says nearly 2/3 plan to steer clear of Sputnik V. Heinz-Gert Pinkanel doesn't share their doubts. On the day of his vaccination, politics is far from his mind.
I actually have a needle phobia.
Sputnik V has yet to be approved in the EU. But Heinz-Gert Pinkanel and his wife are glad that they could afford to travel for the jab.
It's a nice feeling to know that this worked out. And I honestly don't really care if it's been approved in Europe. For me, it's simple. I've been vaccinated now, and I feel safe. The studies so far have shown it's effective. And now we're looking forward to maybe being able to travel again in the future.
Vielleicht dann auch in Zukunft wieder reisen zu dürfen.
Now freshly vaccinated, it's time for some sightseeing. In Russia, the pandemic almost seems like a far-off memory, even if some experts warn a third COVID wave could already be underway. Here in her home country, Katja Harms is enjoying freedoms she's been missing in Germany.
I'm proud of my country, and I feel great here in Russia. In Germany, I've lost this sense of freedom, of strolling calmly down the street without a mask, eating at restaurants, traveling. It's wonderful.
In Deutschland, das ist ein permanentes Achterbahnfahren im Endeffekt.
In Germany, it's been a constant roller coaster ride. You never know what's next.
Man merkt, dass die Politiker.
You can tell that the politicians and decision makers are just floundering helplessly, and that makes you feel helpless as well. And at the same time, it also forces you to take on personal responsibility and book a trip like this one, for instance.
Auf der anderen Seite aber eben dazu treibt, Eigenverantwortung zu übernehmen und dann zum Beispiel so eine Reise zu buchen.
A controversial opinion, perhaps, but according to the tourist agency, hundreds of Germans have already booked their own vaccination trips to Moscow. Sputnik V would almost be a luxury item if it weren't so unpopular here at home.
Scotland is a place with a rich and unique cultural identity. Some believe the country should be independent from the United Kingdom. It's a view held by the ruling Scottish Nationalist Party. They want to return to the European Union after Brexit forced them out. If they can expand their majority in upcoming elections, they are promising a new referendum on independence. But the countries are strongly intertwined, and some who were once for Scottish independence worry a split could throw their lives off kilter.
Another windy day in Scotland. As always, Howie Nicholsby, a second-generation kilt maker, cycles to work in the traditional Scottish men's garment. He enjoys the 30-kilometre coastal ride near the Firth of Forth estuary, just north of Edinburgh.
I feel Scottish first. You are who you are from where you're born and the society that is around you. And Scottish society is different from English, Welsh and Irish society. We have our own culture, music, language, art, history. That's what makes a culture.
Howie's father taught him how to make kilts decades ago. These days, Howie designs and sells the traditional Scottish clothing items around the world. The EU is a key market for him. 7.5 meters of fabric are needed to make a single kilt.
So that's how much material is in a man's kilt.
Howie voted in favour of Scottish independence in the 2014 referendum. He does still believe Scotland should be an autonomous country, but Brexit and the pandemic have given him doubts. He thinks independence could be risky, dividing society and even his family.
It is becoming sensitive again. And disharmony that created within a family unit, so that spread right across the whole of Scotland and into England.
We head to the capital and seat of the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh to see what people think about independence. Many here tell us they'd be happy to leave Britain.
We have assets, great assets, and I think throughout this as well, interestingly, especially in Edinburgh being the capital, there's been a real community feel, great entrepreneurship, so I think that will be to the benefit of our country.
Well, I think Scotland is a lot more liberal as a country rather than England, and those choices we can make on our own really, and not have to go down to Westminster for approval, which I don't think we get.
Others, meanwhile, feel that after the Brexit turmoil, Scotland needs to let the dust settle.
I think we should stay in the Union. I think that Brexit, I didn't want Brexit, and that has been, an absolute nightmare. So why would you want to break up a union that's, hundreds and hundreds of years? I think it would cost a lot of money. I think it would be terrible for the economy, and I don't think Scotland can afford to be independent.
We have a devolved parliament. They have taxation powers. They have quite a lot of power. So I don't see what else they want.
Many Scots living near the Anglo-Scottish border, some 100 kilometres south of Edinburgh, oppose the idea of independence. John Elliott's cattle farm overlooks the Cheviot Hills that straddle the border. Many people here work and shop over in England.
We're aware that that if there was any trade barriers, it would be very difficult in this area, because at the moment a lot of the communities are integrated between England and Scotland in this area, and I think that's would be a shame if there was any sort of barrier between the two.
John Elliott runs the farm together with his father. They sell Aberdeen Angus cattle for breeding to the EU and elsewhere. So international trade is important. But to them, keeping Scotland and Britain is even more important.
I personally voted in the EU referendum to remain within Europe, but I think if I was asked the question now, would I want to go through it all again and to try and achieve to get back into Europe, I think my answer would be no. I think the Union at the moment seems to be doing okay. We've had a lot of the pain and got through it.
Kilt maker Howie Nicholsby has thought long and hard about the possible economic consequences of Scottish independence. And he thinks independence will have to wait for now.
I only want an independent Scotland if it's good for Scotland and the Scottish people, and it feels too much that it's politicians and politics and party rivalry as opposed to thinking on a business level and strategy and plan of how it's actually going to work.
The drive for independence will continue to impact Scots like Howie Nicholsby and his family. And Brexit has only served to stoke the fire.
30 years ago, the Yugoslav wars broke out in Europe. More than 100,000 people were killed in the decade that followed. While the scars of the war are still visible, ruins serve as a reminder of the conflict that tore through the Balkans. One artist in Serbia is using the debris to heal the wounds of the past. His childhood was marred with the sounds of destruction, but he's working through the trauma with the help of a secret weapon.
Checking military scrap for its acoustic properties. Serbian artist Nikola Matsura is scouring a junkyard for old guns, ammunition, and army equipment from the Yugoslav wars. One day, he hopes to find a tank. In his studio in the city of Novi Sad, Matsura turns old army equipment into musical instruments. Guitars, built using helmets and Kalashnikov rifles. And string instruments like this cello, made from canisters and grenade launchers.
I don't really have a favorite instrument, but this cello means a lot to me. It produces a fabulous sound. It's the best instrument I've made from an acoustic standpoint.
Nikola wants this so-called bombophone, made from a grenade launcher and helmet, to sound like a saxophone.
Just few tones. Yeah. It does make a few sounds, but not that many, and they're not very clean. I'd need at least a pentatonic scale so I can improvise. That's the direction we want to take the bombophone.
Nikola has found another grenade launcher that will be ideal for building a new, even better bombophone.
But first I need to properly clean the tube, remove the old layer of paint and give it a new one. Not a military colour though. I need to add finger holes too. We'll only be able to tell if it's any good when we add the mouthpiece and blow.
Cellist Milica Svirac tunes the grenade launcher cello. She advised Nikola on crafting the instrument. Milica, like the other musicians, supports Nikola's art project.
I was still very young during the war. I remember NATO bombs coming down on Serbia. Those are grim memories. But this project shows that we can transform ugly objects and grim events into something positive.
An impressive cello-like sound. Considering this instrument only has 3, not 4 strings, and a body made of metal rather than wood. Nikola is searching another military scrapyard for salvageable objects. This one's even larger than the first. He says many German and Polish collectors come here to buy war relics. Unfortunately, Nikola still hasn't come across a tank.
I won't give up hope. I'll keep searching. Maybe I'll stumble across a tank, somewhere. I'd convert it into a giant percussion instrument and install it outside somewhere.
The day of the trial concert. But one guitar player hasn't shown up. So I get to play the reimagined Kalashnikov rifle. Nikola says he wants the instruments to sound a little off-key. He's happy they now have a more positive purpose.
Slovenia is set to take over the EU Council presidency in July. It's a role that involves mediation between member states and chairing meetings. Pragmatism and a level head are required. But European Parliament members are sounding the alarm over Slovenia's Prime Minister. He is waging a war of words against critical journalists. Parliamentarians say press freedom and democracy are under attack in Slovenia. Journalist Mojca Pašek has been at the receiving end of the Prime Minister's fury. Threats and insults have become a routine part of her job.
These days, journalist Mojca Pasek conducts most of her interviews outside. Here she is on a hill over the Slovenian capital, Ljubljana. Her reporting isn't only hindered by the pandemic, however.
The Facebook page of the public house offers the cheap services of the washed-up prostitutes Evgenia and Mojca. One for 30 euros, the other for 35 euros.
Janez Janša tweeted this in 2016. Last year, he became Slovenia's prime minister.
Actually, that's how it began. And from that March 2016, just explode everything in Slovenia after that tweet, because it was like a point the starting point of insulting, attacking, personal attacks on journalists in Slovenia.
The politician was apparently annoyed by a report that Pasek and her colleague had released. Pasek went to court about the tweet, and Janša was sued for defamation. Pasek is currently working on a report about the Slovenian press agency, which has complained about the government's withdrawal of funds.
It all began early last year. The agency was accused of producing fake news. The attacks got worse in October, and we were described as a national disgrace. For 4 months, we didn't get a cent for our work. I think that the government would do anything to get us under its political control.
DW tried to get an interview with Prime Minister Janša to discuss these allegations. With no success, his spokesman was also reticent.
I have just one question to you about your reaction to the allegations that are made against your Prime Minister that he's undermining press freedom in Slovenia.
No comment.
No comment.
I don't have any comment.
Marko Milosavljević is a media study professor in Ljubljana and a critic of the current government.
And I think that this sort of personal behavior is also a part of the problem. It is a part of a problem when a politician does not agree with the standards of European behavior. If you call journalists prostitutes, if you do these sort of vulgar and aggressive things, which were unimaginable in Europe 10 years ago, then of course we have a wider problem.
There is growing concern in the EU's institutions about the dangers to press freedom in Slovenia. European Commissioner Ylva Johansson addressed the issue.
We have discussed this, and of course the freedom and the pluralism of media is a cornerstone. Also some new things have happened recently when it comes to the financing of the Slovenian press.
The Slovenian Interior Minister said there's no problem and the agency would get paid.
I assured the Commissioner that there was absolute press freedom in Slovenia, and journalists could report freely about anything.
That's what Mojca Pasek hopes, despite her negative experiences and the pressure she has faced for years.
My experience is, in the first place, that you are a little bit depressed. But then again, I am in a fighting mood, and so I think that my professional work is to explain to our public the truth about our government.
Mojca Pasek is determined to keep telling the truth and do her work as best she can.
Imagine being stuck at sea, not in a boat, but in a tower 6 stories high. Sounds like a fairy tale, but it's in fact a lighthouse, France's oldest working one. It was built some 400 years ago to help sailors navigate the strong currents of the Gironde estuary. Well, the unique structure is still manned by lighthouse keepers to this day, though getting to work dry is one problem that still remains centuries later.
That way.
Benoit and Thomas are full of concentration. The tide is coming in, and they'll have to get out fast at the lighthouse.
First we'll unload everything.
It's the changing of the lighthouse keepers. Thomas and Benoit have everything they need for a week. They'll be totally alone as soon as the door shuts. They have to get used to a new rhythm, to a new life.
Once we're here, we're here. We're not going to go anywhere. We'll be able to take our time. When I get here, I'm much calmer than when I'm at home.
The Cordouan Lighthouse in southwestern France is a national monument. It's over 400 years old and boasts 301 steps. But Benoit and Thomas are used to them. They have to check that everything is okay. The beacon is at a height of 70 meters, and it needs regular cleaning.
If there's one thing that has to be perfectly clean, it's this for sure.
The lighthouse still serves as a navigational aid, despite the existence of satellite systems.
It's always important to have a visual aid, just like in a car. Red means you shouldn't come through, it's dangerous. Green means it's safe.
The lights go on automatically after dark. Lighthouse keepers no longer have to light the beacon themselves, but they like coming up anyway.
I think it's great. There are always certain light effects.
The light can be seen from 40 kilometers away. The two always eat together. There are 6 lighthouse keepers in total, and they always do 1 or 2 week shifts in pairs. The next morning, they go for a walk at low tide. The weather's stormy, but they are well equipped. They love it here.
We've got all this space for us. I feel totally free here. The advantage is that we're not locked in at all, despite being at sea.
They go for walks as much as possible. In summer, they show the tourists around, and they also carry out repairs when necessary. Benoit, an electrician and sculptor, pays regular attention to the railings, which get damaged by the weather. He's been working here for 9 years already.
I like these old buildings, the old stones. There's a lot of material to work with, a lot of physical work too. This is what I'm interested in. This is my passion.
1 floor down, Thomas is polishing the copper. After his studies, he worked on cruise ships and at holiday resorts. He found this job by chance.
Nobody will say to me, "Have you polished the copper or not? That's good, that's bad." Most people don't care. We're in the middle of the ocean. There's nobody here to see it. But if I want to do it, I do. I think it's a very positive context to work in. There's no having to do this on a Monday, that on a Tuesday, and this on a Wednesday. This is how I want to live.
The two also have very little contact with the outside world. Phones don't work well. All they have for company is each other, far away from their families.
When I miss my wife and kid, it's not that I want to leave here, it's just that I want to be with them. But otherwise it's good here. If my wife and daughter were here, I could live here the whole year.
They both want to stay in this increasingly rare profession for as long as possible.
A work vacation, no quarantine required. Well, in the summer, UNESCO will decide whether the lighthouse will become a World Heritage Site. Thanks so much for watching Focus on Europe. Do let me know your thoughts about this week's show on Twitter. Bye for now.
To the point. Strong opinions, clear positions, international perspectives.
It's the ultimate COVID catastrophe. Soaring infections, hospitals at breaking point, a death rate that keeps shattering records. Are missteps by the government to blame? Coronavirus in India, out of control? That's our topic on To the Point.
To the Point. In 30 minutes on DW.
Imagine how many portions of lunch are thrown out in the world right now.
Climate change is only half the story.
This is my plastic waste from just 1 week.
How much worse can it really get? We still have time to act.
Go! I'm going all in.
This.
Success. Hit subscribe for more videos like this.
In the eye of climate change. Africa's megacities. What's in store for the people who live here? What ideas do they have for their future? DW.com African Megacities. The multimedia insight. Click and enter. Drag kids. They love flashy wigs, extravagant outfits, and glitter, glitter, glitter.
I'm everything.
They're fighting against prejudice.
I got called gay boy. I did nothing. I was just stressing up.
And for recognition. They are little stars on the big stage. Drag Kids starts May 17th on DW.
This is DW News live from Berlin. Dozens are dead, many more critically injured in a stampede at a Jewish festival in Israel. It's one of the country's deadliest civilian disasters. It happened at the first big religious gathering to be held since Israel lifted coronavirus restrictions. Also coming up, begging for oxygen to save a relative's life in India, people desperately searching for medical supplies as the country battles a record-breaking spike in COVID-19 infections and deaths. And stocking up on provisions and fleeing cities for their hometowns. Turkey enters its strictest lockdown of the pandemic, with the country fighting its own wave of COVID-19 infections. Plus, returning Africa's stolen cultural treasures. Germany will start handing back ancient looted sculptures to Nigeria, plundered during colonial times. Berlin says that it wants to shine a light on its own colonial past. I'm Sarah Kelly. Welcome to the program. In Israel, at least 44 people have been killed and around 150 others injured in a stampede at a religious gathering attended by tens of thousands. It happened at Mount Meron in the northern part of the country, where ultra-Orthodox Jews were holding an all-night prayer and a dance celebration.
This footage from social media shows the scene shortly before tragedy struck. A densely packed crowd dancing ecstatically at the annual Lag BaOmer celebration. Authorities believe overcrowding is likely to blame for the fatalities and injuries. Rescue workers say many of the dead were either trampled to death or suffocated.
We just finished treating one of Israel's worst disasters, a terrible disaster of people who came to celebrate Lag BaOmer at Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and unfortunately were literally crushed to death.
It was the first large-scale religious gathering to be held legally since Israel lifted most coronavirus restrictions. But despite Israel's successful handling of the pandemic, health authorities had warned against holding a gathering of this size. The Lag BaOmer religious festival is particularly popular with Israel's ultra-Orthodox community. Israeli police report nearly 100,000 people attended the gathering, which they say is 4 to 5 times as many as should have been in a location like this.
And let's get more. We are joined by DW correspondent Tanya Kramer in Jerusalem. Tanya, what more do we know?
Well, as you said, the death toll has risen in the past hours, so we know that 38 people have been crushed to death there on site, had been evacuated from there. 6 more have died of their injuries in hospitals now. A lot of those injured, we are talking about roughly 160 people were evacuated to hospitals in the northern part of the country around Mount Meron. And some of them are critically injured, so we're expecting the death toll might be rising even more. Now, the first distress calls were received from the area, that's according to rescue services, in the early morning. And what has been described now, as we also heard in the report, as one of the worst tragedies in the country's history. Also, phone lines and were opener hotlines for people to look for their loved ones, because this was so overcrowded that all the mobile services, of course, went down, and people are still being guided back now to their buses and to come back also here to Jerusalem.
And the Lag BaOmer, as we've been hearing, I mean, this is a celebration. It's considered to be one of the most important in the Orthodox community. It happens every year, Tanya. What went wrong this time, and could it have been prevented?
Well, absolutely. This is one of the major religious festivals for the Haredi, for the ultra-Orthodox community. And last year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, it was severely restricted. And this year's arrangements have been different, and the blame game has already started, on the authorities also, why to allow such a large number to come together. Now, the arrangements were different, and we are hearing from eyewitnesses, and there's a lot of also, of course, videos on social media that are circulating, so there's a lot for investigators now to look at. Now, eyewitnesses have said there were early calls for help from people who felt they were kind of trapped in this crowded area, that barriers in particular areas were not open, and that led to the overcrowding. Now, the event itself had been, and that's interesting, before the event actually happened, had been held at one of the major events now, one of the biggest events, but something went apparently terribly wrong.
Tanya, just briefly, what are the biggest challenges that rescue workers are now facing?
Well, it's a very difficult terrain up on the mount and with a lot of people. But as far as we understand, the search and rescue efforts now, which were massive, with the Israeli army involved and the national rescue services involved, they are mainly now taking people back so those who survived this, those who are evacuated to the hospitals, and those who survived this, so they will be brought back home now.
Tanya Kramer with the very latest, and just to recap for our viewers, at least 44 people killed, around 150 others injured at this stampede at a religious gathering in Israel. Tanya, thank you for bringing us up to date. Let's have a look at some other stories. In Hong Kong, 4 democracy activists have pleaded guilty to charges of illegal assembly for a rally in June of last year. Jailed activist Joshua Wong was among them. Tens of thousands of people gathered on June the 4th to commemorate the 1989 crackdown on protesters in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. At least 13 people have been killed in fighting on the frontier between the Central Asian nations of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Dozens more were injured. Poorly drawn borders dating back to the Soviet Union have caused tension between the two neighbors. Authorities in Los Angeles have charged 5 people with attempted murder and robbery in connection with the theft of Lady Gaga's dogs. The singer's dogs were stolen in February in Hollywood. Gaga's dog walker was shot in the chest during the incident, but survived his injuries. We turn now to India, which is reeling from another record spike in COVID-19 cases, with over 380,000 new infections reported in the past day. Despite international aid arriving, oxygen is still in short supply across the country. Overwhelmed hospitals have been forced to turn patients away, leaving their relatives desperately trying to source medical supplies themselves.
A woman begs. She pleads as she tries to find oxygen for her desperately sick mother. My mother is very seriously ill, and for the past 2 days we've been trying to get a bed in so many hospitals in Delhi. Across India, oxygen is still in desperately short supply. In the capital, Delhi, volunteers from the Sikh community have set up an oxygen centre in a car park. People are suffering, begging for oxygen. We arranged for cylinders from anywhere we could. We stood in queues for whole nights and sometimes got beaten up by the police. Russia is the latest country to join an international relief effort.
Actually, there has been quite an outpouring of, I would say, solidarity with India. There's been an outpouring of, let's say, assistance from various countries. Over 40 countries have actually committed to provide us with many of the items that we need most urgently.
India is the world's biggest producer of vaccines. But these too are lacking as people scramble to get their shot.
There are so many people are suffering here. I have no mercy for them. Where the humanity is gone.
Despite all this, millions have been voting in the state of West Bengal. The infection rate there is the highest since the pandemic began. Political parties have been criticised for holding crowded election rallies, just when India is recording the deadliest days so far for any country during the pandemic.
And our very own Amrita Chima is standing by in Delhi, where she is bureau chief. Amrita, how are people coping?
So the situation is very difficult. We've got terrible numbers coming out of India, another record spike in the number of new infections. The positivity rate in India, across India, is 21%. In Delhi, it's 30%. And in Goa, which is a tourist hub, it's 50%. And the positivity rate means that it is the number of people who test positive in relation to those who are being tested. So that is a very high number. And also the virus is spreading to different states. In southern India, Kerala, which had performed really well in the first surge, is now showing a huge spike in numbers. And West Bengal, especially the city of Calcutta, is showing a huge surge. And that's where also some of these election rallies have taken place. In Delhi, we're seeing record numbers of deaths. The oxygen is still running out. Some of the small hospitals sent SOS distress calls overnight. And the High Court of Delhi has got involved. It's criticized the Indian government, the central government, and saying, why isn't it increasing the supply of oxygen to the city of Delhi?
That's a really big question now, how to get the situation under control. Of course, vaccination is a big part of that, Amrita, as well. We understand that some vaccination centers have closed because of a shortage of vaccines, and yet every adult in India can theoretically get a jab from tomorrow. How should all of this work?
Well, till today, only people over the age of 45 were eligible for vaccination. And as of tomorrow, as you mentioned, every adult in India was eligible for vaccination. The way the vaccinations function here in India, a certain quota of vaccines are sent by the central government to different states, and the rest the states themselves have to procure on their own. And many of the states suddenly find themselves in a position that they have no vaccines. So you have states saying that they'll have to either delay the expansion of the vaccination drive for people over 18, and some have shut down vaccination completely. For example, that's what Mumbai, the city of Mumbai, which is also very badly hit, is saying it's going to stop all vaccination for 3 days till they're able to get more supplies. Now, this, of course, is a huge setback for the Indian government because it was hoping its vaccination drive would help break the chain of transmission and bring down numbers and take some of the pressure out of the very beleaguered health infrastructure.
And against that backdrop, Amrita, I mean, we have to say the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi severely criticized for mismanaging, even denying this crisis. What is the approach now?
Well, the government says it's doing all it can. The Prime Minister held, say, some 21 meetings in the last 2 weeks to deal with the surge. He has another big meeting today with his Council of Ministers. Now, but the critics say all this comes too late, and why didn't the government react earlier? Why didn't the government take advice from its own task force, which back in November was saying things like oxygen supplies might run out, we must prepare for that. So people are quite kind of worried as to why the government simply didn't anticipate this second surge. The government is not taking very kindly to criticism, especially criticism coming from overseas. In fact, Indian embassies overseas have reportedly been told that they should take control of the negative media narrative. They are being asked to explain the Indian government's position, and the Indian government's position is that given the ferocity of the second surge, given the deadly nature of the virus, the various mutants, double mutants and variants, it's very difficult for any government, let alone a country the size of India, to deal with this crisis.
Amrita Chima, DW's Delhi Bureau Chief, with the view from there. Thank you so much for filling us in. And here are some other developments in the pandemic. Health officials in Germany and France say that they have detected the first cases of the coronavirus variant contributing to the deadly surge in infections in India. Global cases of the virus have now surpassed 150 million. More than 3 million of those infected have died. And the UK is temporarily reducing its foreign aid by about 30% due to the economic impact of the pandemic. Thailand is imposing a 14-day quarantine rule for people arriving from abroad. Isolation periods were recently relaxed to help revive the country's tourism industry. In Turkey, the country has entered full lockdown, its strictest since the start of the pandemic, as it fights its own battle with soaring COVID-19 cases and deaths. People have been ordered to stay at home for nearly 3 weeks, only allowed to go outside for grocery shopping and other essential needs. DW correspondent Yulia Han reports from Istanbul.
Saying goodbye, a moment of calm, but only briefly. There is not much time for farewells here in Zincirlikuyu, at one of the largest cemeteries in Istanbul. While the families mourn outside, the next coffins are already arriving. The funeral home workers try to ensure that everything is as dignified as possible. But it has been Turkey's deadliest month since the pandemic began, and that has also become very apparent here.
Before the pandemic, we had around 200 funerals per day. There are now more than twice as many. We urgently need the new lockdown. But we should have made this decision earlier. Then probably fewer people would have died.
Shortly before the new lockdown came into effect, the streets and shops were full again. Above all, alcohol was in great demand because from now on there is a ban on sales. Residents are only allowed to leave their homes for essential needs until mid-May. It is not the first coronavirus curfew in Turkey, but the strictest one so far.
Most of public life is supposed to come to a standstill for 2.5 weeks. But many people are wondering how they will get through this time, as they can't hope for any financial aid.
Especially in the poorer neighborhoods of Istanbul, many are worried. Only a few have permanent jobs here in Tarlabaşı. Most of them make a living as day laborers or trash collectors.
Only God knows how we'll manage. But there is nothing we can do. We will try to survive somehow.
I don't have a husband. My daughter has just had a baby. We are 6 people living in a small room and we already don't have enough money to live on. Critics of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan say he hesitated too long, which made the situation worse. Although Turkey has the highest number of daily new infections in Europe, Erdogan held several party congresses with thousands of members of his ruling AKP in March. A few days ago, he pulled the emergency brake.
We must rapidly reduce the number of new infections to fewer than 5,000 a day. Otherwise, we will inevitably pay a heavy price in every field, from tourism to trade and education.
A small sacrifice, says the president, for a greater goal. In about 2 weeks, at the end of Ramadan, Turkey will emerge from its lockdown, hoping that its latest crisis is under control.
German officials have reached an agreement for the return of sculptures looted from Africa during colonial times. The objects, known as the Benin bronzes, were originally taken by British soldiers in the 19th century. They were later sold to museums worldwide, and many are held in Germany. They are considered to be some of Africa's greatest cultural treasures. German museums are expected to start returning the bronze statues to Nigeria next year. For more, let's bring in correspondent Anya Scharfennorth. She's joining us from Berlin. And Anya, I'd like to just begin by asking you, talk with us about the timing. Why now?
Well, Sarah, here in Germany, restitution of artworks was long focused on art looted during the Nazi era. Germany's colonial past was a bit of a blind spot for a long time. But that's changed in recent years. The discussion around returning artworks looted during the colonial past, especially from Africa, has really picked up, not just here in Germany, but across Europe, really. But up until now, there was a lot of talk, but not very much action. And you can see why, really, if you look at museums across Europe and their collections, many museum directors were simply afraid that they would lose their most prized and their most attractive exhibits. So this decision to actually take action and to decide that the Benin bronzes will be returned to Nigeria next year is a big step towards righting the wrongs of the past, really. And the Benin bronzes have always been a focus, of course, for restitution because they are considered the most prized African artifacts. And they've fetched millions of euros at auction. And this decision came about after Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, visited Nigeria in March, and he signaled his support for the restitution of the bronzes. And they're now, after their return to Nigeria next year, they're meant to be going to a new museum that's being built there for West African art.
What could the decision mean for other museums now?
Well, this is definitely a historic step, I would say, that will have repercussions for